Welcome back to 303 in Sophomore English. We turn in our hymnals to page 452 and following. We are in the introductory comments of Unit 4, our unit on reading the informal essays, speeches, addresses, and the like. And we now turn to independent practice. Now, hey, let me remind you what we have said a number of times. Learning how to read nonfiction is a skill set that you have to develop. When you're reading stories, often you can get caught up in the plot, in the action, in the conflict, in the excitement, in the suspense. Reading essays, reading nonfiction is a different kind of experience. It requires a different level of cognitive focus, intellectual focus. So I'm going to challenge you to do that now. Hey, by the way, notice, just to remember from Unit 1 and Unit 2, we're engaged in independent practice. Do you see box 12? Do you notice that it has a question mark? Do you see box 13? Do you notice that it ends with a question mark? On page 453, do you see box 14? Do you notice it ends with a question mark? As we go through this reading together, I want you to be paying attention to those boxes with those question marks. We obviously want to answer each one of those. Most of those have to do with level, by the way, 2. Notice 2A, themes, messages. 2B, any number of concerns. The imagery, the organizational structure, the tone and the word choice, all of these fall within 2B. So as we go through this annotative work now, make sure you're getting that information in 2B. First of all, about the selection. I hope you're reading with me on 452. The dangers, are you reading with me? The dangers of high-altitude mountain climbing are severe. Many climbers fall sick or even die from illness caused by reduced oxygen. Others freeze or plummet to their death. Despite these risks, Erik Weihenmayer, a blind climber, read it again, a blind climber, had successfully reached the summits of 5 of the world's highest peaks by 1999. In that year, with Pascal P.V. Skretos, a geophysicist and expert climber, suggested an expedition to the top of Mount Everest. Weihenmayer readily agreed. He arranged sponsorship from the National Federation of the Blind, and with Skutaro, organized the expedition. The other members of the team are listed. Bull and his son Brad, a Sherpa who had climbed Everest twice, a longtime buddy of his, Ari Alexander, Jeff Evans, Chris Morris, Michael Donnell, and finally, on May 25th, 2001, Weihenmayer and many of his teammates reached the top of Mount Everest. Dude, write this down. This is this is amazing. A blind person climbed the hardest mountain in the world, and he made it. Truly remarkable, right? This excerpt is going to describe the final leg of that adventure, and so I hope already your interests have been somewhat piqued by just, what's it like to be blind? Well, I don't know. Shut your eyes, for example, here in a second when you leave 303 and walk all the way home or all the way to your car with your eyes shut and get a sense of how everything changes in that experience with sense deprivation or sense heightened, right? Here we're going to learn a little bit about what this experience was like. So we want to pay close attention now as we follow along with our professional reader. Just enjoy. Get into the prose. Get into the language. Let's be blown away by an experience like this one.
Everest, From Touch the Top of the World, by Erik Weihenmayer. We left our tents a little before 9 p.m. on May 24. Because of our 24-hour delay and the apprehension of other expeditions to share a summit day with me, we moved across the South Col with only one other team behind us. We had no worries of the typical hordes clogging the fixed lines, but could direct our full focus toward the mountain. The wind was blowing so loudly through the col that I couldn't hear the bells jingling from Chris's ice axe. Chris and I expected this, so for the first 2 hours he clanked his metal axe against rocks he passed. Finally, we worked our way around to the mountain's leeward side, where Everest itself protected us from the wind. Chris had lost his voice, so his verbal directions were sparse. At each anchor, he'd hold the new line with his hand so I could locate it and clip in. Chris was moving in front of me at his usual rock-solid pace, and I was right on his heels. We were making unbelievable time.
I've had students that were like, it didn't occur, I mean, they read everything that we just read. They even put it in their notes. They even wrote it down. But when I asked the simple question, what's the big deal about the wind blowing so loud you can't hear a bell? Dude, who cares about the bell? When you can't see, all you can do is hear. So the only way that you know where to go is the person in front of you is ringing a bell. Of course, you got a problem if you can't hear the ringing of the bell because the wind's blowing so hard, right? So notice already we've got some powerful challenges that are a part of not just climbing Everest, but climbing Everest without your sight. I'm on page 452. Let's really try and concentrate, see how well we get through this now. Okay? Enjoy this reading, all right, guys?
As we got higher up the mountain, 4 distinct changes had begun to work in my favor. Earlier in the icefall, each step was very specific, but the terrain above the South Col consisted of steep 45-degree snow faces 100 yards wide, intermingled with 10 to 50-foot crumbly rock steps. I could stay in the kicked boot holes of Chris or kick my own steps. Where I stepped had become less important than maintaining internal balance. I could breathe, scan my ice axe, and count on the next step. The slope was often so steep that I could lean forward and feel the rock or snow steps with my gloved hands, and I had trained myself long ago to save energy by landing my feet in the same holds my hands had just left. Finally, when I needed it most, the mountain had given me a pattern.
453.
The thin oxygen of extreme altitude reduced us to a crawl. It was like moving through a bizarre atmosphere of syrup mixed with a narcotic. My team, struggling just to put one foot in front of the other, moved so slowly it gave me more time to scan my axe across the snow and feel my way forward. The third equalizer was the darkness. With just a trickle of light produced by headlamps, my sighted team could only see a few feet in front of them. Bulky goggles blocked their side vision, and oxygen masks covered much of their visual field. Also, the pure oxygen trickling through their masks would flow up and freeze the lenses of their goggles so that they constantly had to remove them to wipe the lenses clean. Those brief moments when eyes are exposed to the elements, corneas will freeze, and the intense rays of the sun reflecting off the snow cause instant snow blindness. Not once did I ever have to worry about these complications.
Okay, pause, write it down at level 1. What's the next challenge that comes up? You've heard the phrase, the blind leading the blind? That's exactly what's going on here. Notice he says, the next problem, which was kind of ironic, was that the people leading me, they started to have serious problems with eyesight. By the way, a number of people have in fact been blinded for life from trying to climb Everest, because of the intensity of the elements that are involved in what it is that he's talking about, especially the lack of oxygen that has to do with this, right? And so we have serious challenges. Of course, it's unspoken here, but can you just jot down in your notes the level of fear that has to be felt when you are trying to scale the world's highest peak and you can't see, and you know that the people who are leading you also are struggling to see. They can barely see what's in front of them, and they've got this climb they've got to do. Of course, lots of energy is going to be expended to do this, no doubt about it, but just think about the fear that's involved in this, right? By the way, notice that as this writer is writing about this, there's not a lot of emotion. Have you noticed this? Not a lot of emotional content here. It's more just about, let me tell you how this went down. Pretty remarkable stuff. Of course, this is an act of great courage, isn't it? No doubt, no doubt.
In addition, my teammates had chosen smaller masks that rode low and tight across their cheeks and hung mostly below their chins. This allowed climbers to see better and prevented pure oxygen from seeping into their lenses, but also allowed plenty of pure oxygen to escape into the wind. I, on the other hand, had the luxury of choosing the largest mask I could find and wore it high on my face, getting the most benefit from the oxygen flow and the ambient air around the mask. I'm sure I made a freakish sight with my gigantic mask covering my goggles, like a day long ago in wrestling practice when I had put my sweatshirt on backward, with the hood covering my face, and chased the terrified freshmen around the mat. The consistent terrain, the altitude, the mask, and the darkness were great equalizers. I wouldn't go so far as to claim these gave me an advantage, but it was a matter of perspective. The mountain had gotten desperately harder for everyone else, while it had gotten slightly easier for me.
Bit ironic, right? Bit ironic.
For 2.5 months, all the decisions, the logistics, the backup safety plans had been implemented and executed by PV, and now, somewhere below the balcony, the exhausting burden of leadership finally took its toll. Suddenly feeling listless and unable to catch his breath even with his oxygen bottle at full flow, PV had arduously turned back. He managed to convince Brad and Sherm, next to him, that he was strong enough to descend alone, in retrospect a ploy that might have turned deadly, but PV's weary brain had never stopped calculating the big picture. He had refused to divert any energy from the team's summit effort. Through periodic radio checks as PV dropped altitude, I could hear his characteristically hyper voice growing flat, and just below a steep ice bulge, only an hour from Camp 4, PV sat down in the snow.
454.
I'm very tired, he said. I don't know if I can make it. I might need some assistance. PV's one warning before we left the tent was, if you sit down, you'll stay there. So, beginning to panic, I ripped my radio out of my pocket. Is anyone near PV who can help him down? I asked. Is anyone reading me? I repeated myself several times to empty static.
Seriously dangerous, right?
A few weeks earlier, Dr. Geip had received the sad news that a close family friend had been killed in a skiing accident. A 3,000-foot day in the death zone just didn't seem fair to his family, so that night he had never left his tent. His decision was a tough one to make, but extremely fortunate for PV's sake. This is Geip at the South Col, finally came over the radio. I'm strapping on my crampons right now. I'm going out to get PV. Dr. Geip met PV about a half an hour from camp, up again and staggering slowly toward the tents. With the first crisis of the night averted, Chris and I plodded up a steep gully, which led us to the balcony, a flat snow platform 10 feet wide. Michael Brown arrived first at about 2 a.m., with Chris and me right behind. All night, the weather had remained clear, with high clouds to the southeast and distant lightning flashes illuminating the sky, but at the balcony, our luck suddenly ran out. We walked into a blasting storm. Wind and horizontal snow raked our down suits and covered us with a layer of ice. The lightning strikes were now on top of us, exploding like a pyrotechnic show. Chris later said he couldn't see his feet through the blowing snow, which stopped us short since the southeast ridge above narrowed to 15 feet wide. Mike O's and Diedrich's headlamps had simultaneously flickered out, and one of Diedrich's crampons had popped off. "Someone come and help us," Mike yelled over the radio. Charlie headed back and found them sitting in the snow only 20 feet away. Chris and I huddled together in the wind, waiting for the others to arrive. "What do you think, Big E?" he asked. "It's looking pretty grim." When the others trickled in, Sherm wanted to go on. Charlie wanted to turn back, and Erie thought we should wait. For 45 minutes we waited, periodic arguments breaking out whether to go on or descend. I was beginning to shiver and forced myself to bounce up and down, and to windmill my arms. We were so close and I was feeling strong. Turning back was a crushing proposition, but I also wasn't willing to go bullheadedly forward and throw my life away. My mind was starting to settle on the possibility of turning back when Kevin's voice from base camp crackled over my radio. Throughout the expedition, Kevin had been learning to read the satellite weather reports we received every few days over the internet. From the weather map, it appeared the storm was moving rapidly to the northeast toward Bhutan, and where we stood on the balcony, we were directly northeast of base camp.
455.
"Hey, you guys, don't quit yet," His voice sounded urgent. "The storm's cleared down here. It just might pass over you." "Weather is also clearing here," Kami said from Camp 2 below. Following the narrow, exposed southeast shoulder, I felt the first warmth of the sun about 4 a.m. So high up, no other mountain blocked the sunrise. The weather had thankfully turned spectacular. Still hours below the south summit, we were stalled out again. The fixed lines, running up the steepest slope yet, had been frozen over by a hard windswept crust of snow. Jeff and Brad moved ahead, pulling the lines free. An exhausting job at 28,000 feet. The job was quickly wearing Jeff down, but he said later that with each grasping breath as he heaved the rope free, he envisioned the two of us standing on top together. Soon he was beginning to feel faint and dizzy. As he knelt in the snow, Brad, behind him, examined his oxygen equipment and assessed that his regulator, connecting the long tube of his mask to his bottle, had malfunctioned. The internal valves responsible for regulating flow were notoriously prone to freezing shut. "Who's got an extra regulator?" Brad called out over the radio, but tired bodies and brains could not recall who had thrown in the extras in the pre-summit shuffle. "My day's finished if I can't find the extra," Jeff yelled testily. It may not have been PB's time to summit, but he wasn't through benefiting the team. "Calm down," he advised, lying weakly on his back in his tent. "Everyone take a deep breath. En Passant and Sherm are carrying the extra regulators." Luckily, En Passant was only 100 feet behind. Together, Brad and En Passant screwed on Jeff's new regulator. By 8 a.m., we had struggled on to the south summit, 28,700 feet. After a short rest, Chris took off for the summit, cranking it into Morris gear, and Luis took over in front of me. From the south summit, the true summit is still at least 2 hours away across the 300-foot-long knife-edge ridge, up the 50-foot vertical Hillary step, and finally traversing up a long, slightly broader ridge to the summit. Jeff, exhausted from his 2-hour struggle pulling lines, stopped short in front of me. "I'm wasted. I've got to go down," he said reluctantly. "This'll have to be my summit."
456.
For a moment, I wanted to goad him on, the way we had done each other on winter training climbs of Colorado 14ers. "If you want to turn back, just say the word," we'd jab. "Of course, I'll have to tell everyone you were a whiny little crybaby." But 28,700 feet above sea level wasn't the place to motivate with bravado or ego, so assessing that he was strong enough to get down, I rested a hand on Jeff's shoulder and wished him a safe descent. Jeff had been with me from the beginning, practically introducing me to the mountains. He had shown extraordinary patience as I stumbled along experimenting with brand new trekking poles. We had even stood together on the summit of Denali and El Capitan, so I knew that reaching the summit of Mount Everest without him wouldn't feel complete. Suddenly, a wave of heavy exhaustion passed over me, and I felt weary and crumpled. "Maybe I'll go down too," I readied my lips to say, but then Luis was crunching through the snow in front of me, and I forced myself to revive. Down climbing the 20-foot vertical snow...
Let's just pause for a moment and write it down at level 1, because this is a little bit of a lengthy reading, and so we like to pause and collect ourselves. Jot down on your notes, what is the central challenges that are happening here as our narrator is trying to ascend to Everest? How would you qualify it? Well, at least 3 things. 1, as anyone who has ever talked about trying to scale Everest has said, weather. It's always a serious issue because you never know, and serious storms can come in a matter of seconds and can kill so quickly. The weather, the cold, intense. Number 2, you've got the challenges, of course, of fatigue physically. Your body starts to literally break down going through the process of this ascent. So notice you got several guys who are saying, I cannot physically continue to do this anymore. I don't have the strength to do it anymore. I've got to go back. Of course, going back is no small proposition. You can die and many do on Everest, going back. Not up, but going back. That is to say, they're so fatigued they can't get back in time to their camp. Finally, number 3, you notice here, it's just not a physical challenge. It's not just a weather challenge. It's an emotive challenge. It's an emotional, it's a mental challenge, right? In other words, do you quit? Do you keep going? Do you all the training, all the preparation, all the money, all the time culminates with being literally just a few hundred feet away from the summit, and you go, I can't do this. I mentally can't do this. And waves of fatigue start to come over the body. Let's pay attention now to the ways in which this thing culminates. It's remarkable, isn't it? And he's doing it without eyesight. Amazing. Amazing.
Face on the backside of the south summit, leading onto the knife-edge ridge, went against my survival instinct. The ridge is the width of a picnic table and always heavily corniced with snow. To the left is an 8,000-foot drop into Nepal, and on the right, a 12,000-foot drop into Tibet. PV had told me that while crossing the ridge on his 1998 attempt, he had driven his ice axe into the snow, and after withdrawing it, had stared through the small hole into the early morning light of Tibet. In 1995, on Brad's second attempt, a climber in front of him had taken his first step onto the ridge just before the entire right half of it dropped away. The climber jumped back to safety, but a second later, he would have ridden the cornice into Tibet. This year, the ridge was drier and more stable. Frozen boot steps traversed along the left-hand side. I'd scan my pole until it dropped into a boot mark, then cautiously lower my foot. I knew I couldn't make a mistake here. 6 hard, steady breaths, another solid step, and a